I'm Cash Earhart. I'm the Director of Student Programs at the University of Virginia's Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership. I invite my colleagues to introduce themselves.
I'm Margaret Miller, and I'm the Curriculum Specialist at West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
I'm Donald Lundberg. I'm a lawyer from Indianapolis, Indiana. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Vincent Caruso, and along with my teammates Amelia Sacco and David Simon, with preparation from our teacher, Mr. Bader, we'll be answering questions for Unit 6.
Thank you. The question that we'll entertain this afternoon is number 2. 31 countries have some form of mandatory voting. More than half back up the legal requirement with an enforcement mechanism. Should the United States make voting mandatory for federal primary and general elections? Why or why not? What are the advantages and disadvantages of mandatory voting? In what ways other than mandatory voting might the United States enhance turnouts at elections? You may begin.
As Charles Montesquieu once wrote, there is no nation so powerful as the one that obeys its laws not from principles of fear or reason, but from passion. The United States should not make voting mandatory, as those who exercise their right do it out of civic virtue and passion for participation, not as a requirement of law. Implementing compulsory voting does not guarantee an accurate reflection of the majority or be in the best interest of the public. Currently, close to 50% of the voting age population chooses not to vote in national elections, and the percent is lower in other elections and primaries. The present system of absentee voting is a very complex system and would be difficult with this country's population of over 300 million people. Even with 50% voting in some areas, people need to wait online for hours to cast their vote, and mandatory voting would overload this system. It's also necessary to devote law enforcement to discover who may or may not have broken compulsory voting laws, meaning resources and a budget are needed to enforce these fines as a result of choosing not to vote.
A government mandate requiring every citizen to vote could bring about a needed positive change to the nation in regards of civics. However, it could also bring an uncertainty and an unwillingness to do so. James Madison wrote that it is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. The great body and will of the majority would be represented if voting was mandatory nationwide. Instead of voting being classified as a privilege, if mandated, like in countries such as Australia or Brazil, it would become a vital civic duty, like jury duty, paying taxes, or attending school. By creating a mandate, the citizens would become more apt and willing to inform themselves of each candidate or policy, since they are now required to vote, in turn increasing civic knowledge and engagement, creating the informed society of the people the Founding Fathers desired. However, this aspect could also create an opposite effect. Voters who are required to go to the polls may just mindlessly choose a ballot in order to get it over with, rather than thoughtfully weigh their options, thus creating an even less informed society. Compulsory voting could bring about the uninformed voters the Founding Fathers feared, or the great body they desired.
Mandatory voting is not the only avenue which can be used to increase voter turnout. Having more state governments extend the voting period to more than one day, and the federal government requiring them all to provide the option of early voting could accomplish this. Currently, only 33 states and the District of Columbia allow early voting with no justification or excuse required, providing more opportunities to reach the voting booths. Enfranchising the incarcerated could also effectively increase voter turnout. Only Maine and Vermont allow their felons to keep their voting rights, but a total of 11 states disenfranchise any felon for life. Another possibility is for voter ID laws to be abolished. In the 2014 midterm election, voter ID laws denied about 600,000 Texan voters their essential privilege as citizens. Furthermore, lowering the voter age would also be a viable option. In the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, 16 and 17-year-olds were allowed to vote, causing an unprecedented 97% turnout rate of the eligible electorate. Recently, Hyattsville and Tacoma Park, Maryland, have become the first two municipalities to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. Through these instances, the U.S. could both effectively and practically enhance turnout at elections. Thank you very much. We are now ready to answer your following questions.
Thank you. Just as you were closing there, you cited that extending voting rights to 16, 17-year-olds. For over 20 years, we've been putting a lot of resources into efforts like Rock the Vote to try to get younger voters to come out. And they do in some cases for presidential elections, but then they disappear for midterms. They're almost completely absent from local elections. Why should we continue to put resources towards getting younger voters out if they're just going to skew the results?
I believe if you put more resources towards the younger generation or voters, it would instill a habit for them, even if their political efficacy is to think that their vote might not matter in such elections as to the localities. That is actually where their vote matters the most, since the elected representatives there answer directly to their constituents and those voting. In order to promote this great duty that they should go out and vote, it should be heavily implemented in those instances still.
You mentioned the differences in states in the voting procedures and the registration procedures. So would you advocate for a national framework for registration and voting procedures and election day and that kind of thing? And if so, what would it be?
A mandatory national?
Yeah, nationally. We all do it the same. All the states register the same. Everybody votes. We have the same rules for absentee, early voting. Do you advocate for that, or is it an overstepping of the federal government's?
I would not advocate for this. I do feel like it would be an overstepping of the federal government to implement all of these regulations. It would breach a natural right of liberty for these citizens who are forced to be registering and casting a vote.
We also, with this, it would also infringe upon the fundamental constitutional principle of federalism. But, however, I do feel that it should be required to have a registration, just registration to be required through all. So that would allow for people, though they would have to be registered, it would still allow them to practice their First Amendment right to speak or to not to by even voting.
I think it was you, Ms. Sacco, who kind of set up the dichotomy or the tension between our electoral process as being one that recognizes people acting out of passion and an obligation that grows out of civic virtue versus the need to be representative and to represent the great body of society. So you, panelists, are now consultants to the government to help us decide if we've got limited dollars, where are we going to put it? The quality of the voter, the quantity of the voter, and why?
I believe that it should be for the quality of the voter, because civic education and knowledge is essential in order to provide the tools for the Americans to go out and make their own stories, great stories that we learn about in schools today. For example, in Indiana, the state legislators appropriated $300,000 in order for them to come to this competition for We the People, and these programs promote the quality of the voters rather than the quantity of how much.
The quality of the voters is definitely the most important, rather than the quantity. We can bring it back to the founding fathers. They were afraid that the people weren't going to be as enlightened or as informed as they were because they were the elite, which is why they instituted the Electoral College. But for us, now with the ability to have the media and to increase civic education in our schools would allow for the people to have a great understanding and to be able to practice politics in the way that they should, with the privilege of citizens to be able to vote and have a say in their government.
Well, it almost sounds to me like you're suspicious of people who don't go to the polls with some high-minded purpose, and that you're at least implicitly critical of people who go to the polls to say, I'm voting here because I care about what's in it for me. Is that what you're saying, or are you okay with the person that says, I just want to vote for the candidate who's best for me?
I don't believe that's an issue because the representatives of Congress and also the president are there to perpetuate the wants and desires both socially, politically, and economically of the people. But for the people that don't vote, I feel like that is okay if they know in their hearts that they are not as informed, or they don't feel like it's that they would be able to make the best judgment. So if we bring it back to the mandatory voting, that's an essential reason why people shouldn't be allowed to vote if they don't have the necessary knowledge to make the best decision.
So we're going to disregard the last 200 years, the expanding of voting to African Americans, to women, to folks over the age of 18, and say that we don't need to bring in more people to the polls now. We've got plenty. If anything, we've got too many, so we only want the well-informed voters to come to the polls. Is that what you're saying?
Well, with the last 200 years, it's been able to give the opportunity to vote, because through legislation made from Congress trying to impose limitations on African Americans in voting through having them have to take reading tests, literacy tests. Those were instituted. I see that my time's up. May I conclude?
Sir.
Having mandatory voting people should have the ability to vote, not necessarily the enforcement of them to vote certain ways. Though
I think I got you. That's all right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think it was a very powerful statement that I'm pretty sure you were trending toward at the end, that, you know, it's more important that folks have the freedom, the opportunity to decide whether or not they're going to vote. Not that I'm going to speak for you or anything. Just set your fears at rest. Thank you very much. It was a very passionate argument that you all made. And one with a lot of hard realities, you know, ID laws in Texas and the ramifications of that policy. The fact that if we're going to come up with compulsory voting, it's going to cost money. But so is education. I mean, there's some hard truths that are going to be needed